Well, it's been a while. Why don't we look at another book together? Welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 38 years. And one of the things I love to do is share any interesting information that I come across as I'm reading books and looking at things on the internet. This particular book I discovered when I was sorting through the books that had been donated to our church library, which is one of my jobs. When people donate bags of books, I go through them and decide which ones belong in our library and which ones might be better off passed on somewhere else. And one of the times recently that I did go through a bag of books that was donated, I came across this book, which is called Run from the Pale Pony, and it's by a man named Ronald Pruet, but also co-authored along with his wife. More about that in a minute. But I wondered, okay, so why is this in a church library? I brought the book home to read and discovered that Ronald developed the symptoms which would soon be diagnosed as multiple sclerosis in his mid-30s, back in the early 1960s. And we know that treatment of MS in the 20th century was nowhere near as advanced as it is even now in the 21st, although there's a long way to go. We still aren't sure of the cause. We don't have a cure. The treatments that mitigate symptoms might or might not be effective depending on your situation. So we still have a long way to go. But imagine being back in the 1960s and developing multiple sclerosis. I'm not even sure what they used to diagnose it then. He does talk about spinal taps, but they didn't have an MRI back then. So I think it was just a question of looking at his symptoms and looking at his spinal fluid and making some determinations based on that. His first symptoms actually were strange numbness that seemed to be spreading. He decided he would go to his local hospital that was in Abilene, Texas, and they were going to do a full workup on him, so they admitted him to the hospital. But he was only there for a little while before he suddenly and inexplicably lost the ability to walk. Given that, it was arranged that he would be flown to Mayo in Rochester, Minnesota, where the doctors did prescribe a treatment that they thought was pretty controversial at the time, and they were a little nervous about him wanting to come back to Texas and do it there. But they worked with the doctors in Abilene, and they were able to do it. What it consisted of, basically, was steroids, prednisone. It got the inflammation down and gave him back the ability to walk. Although the MS did continue to progress over time, at least for a while, he wasn't dealing with the problems that he had right at the first. Even back then, the doctors knew that MS is not a terminal disease, and they told him he was going to live pretty much a long life. And as it turns out, he died at 75. I looked it up on the internet, and I found that he passed away at the age of 75. I would say that 75 years old is probably right in line with the life expectancy for men at that time. But I'm getting ahead of myself, I think. I need to talk a little bit about the book in general. It is divided into 3 sections. The first section talks about his course of MS, how it got started, and the logistics of what actually happened to him. The doctors, the hospitals, the treatments, the waiting, etc. The second part, I think, is the most interesting part in many ways, and it's kind of his observations on how he has learned to think of it and deal with it over time. And this is why the book is in the church library, because the author is a man of faith, and his discussion of how he's dealt with this chronic illness has very much been centered in his Christian beliefs and perspective. And that also explains the title of the book, because Revelation chapter 6 talks about the pale horse as one of the four horses of the apocalypse, but he's referring to MS as a pale pony. Not that that's necessarily more manageable, but because it's just not as mighty. I don't know. He doesn't actually refer to the pale pony a lot throughout the book, but well, he actually says this is where he gets the image from. And then the third section was written by his wife, who was his primary caregiver, essentially. We don't hear enough from caregivers, so I really appreciate her honesty. When she thinks about having a husband who, in the prime of his life, he was very active. He was a lot like the typical type A personality. He was a businessman, and he was a partner in a company that was doing a leasing business. And this really threw them both for a loop, because suddenly he went from being the person she counted on to be the breadwinner and to take care of everything that needed taken care of in the family, to someone who knew what the future was going to hold. It wasn't what she thought she was getting herself into, and she loved him very deeply, but she had to confess that she was feeling kind of resentful. She knew that wasn't the right thing to feel because it wasn't his fault. He didn't do it on purpose, but she was still feeling depressed and anxious and resentful, worried about the future, worried about what was going to happen to them. They had some children that they knew that their lives would be very affected by what was happening. And as someone who was diagnosed also early on, I was diagnosed in the 80s, but even so, it's kind of interesting once again how medicine had not really evolved all that much in the field of MS. From the 1960s to the 1980s, people were still using steroids for a lot of the treatment. And in fact, I had a course of steroids a number of times when I had optic neuritis, and I think they worked really well. But I know doctors don't really like to use steroids much because they do have some nasty side effects for some people, thankfully not for me. And they also can have some side effects that are more damaging and more long-term. So doctors try to get you back off of the steroids as soon as possible. But let's go ahead then and just take a look at this middle section of the book, because that is kind of why the book was written. It wasn't written as a memoir where I'm just going to tell you all of my tales of woe and how I dealt with it. It was more to encourage others who are dealing with chronic illness, either as the person who has the chronic illness or the caregiver or other loved one of that person. And also maybe even for the medical community, that you can get some insights on what it is like to be dealing with this chronic illness that cannot be cured and has no known cause. Here's the model that Ronald Pruet uses when he thinks about coping with chronic illness, any chronic illness, not just multiple sclerosis, but of course his experience is in MS. And I need to preface this by saying that he looks at the connection between the body, spirit, and soul pretty much the way a video that I did in the past talks about that there is a mind-body connection, and that what happens in the body affects the spirit, the soul, and what happens in your soul and your spirit affects your body. And all of that comes together to determine how you feel and how you're going to go forward. So he starts at the bottom here on the left with what he calls crashing, and that is when you first have to reckon with the fact that you do indeed have this chronic illness, that it is not going to just be something you can either shrug off or take a pill for or whatever. It's just going to be part of your life. And the crashing phase is pretty important because there are a couple of ways that you can go with that. One of the things he talks about is giving up, that some people just say, I give up. And that isn't really that helpful. And also the question that you ask quite frequently throughout this process is, why me? You're kind of questioning why indeed, why do you have this happen to you? what brought this on, or, kind of all this what if stuff, which again isn't all that helpful, is it? If you look at this model as a whole, and he says this at some point, that as you can see, it goes upwards to the right. And he said it's always easier to fall back down than it is to climb up. You can see how much easier it would be to just kind of fall back if you get to one of the higher stages. If your attitude is not right, you're going to find yourself falling back down again to a lower stage, maybe even all the way down to the crashing stage where you either say, I give up, or you just say, why me, and you moan about it. The one that comes next, once you get past the crashing stage, and I think we're all entitled to the crashing stage, when this really dawns on us that this is a condition we're going to have for the rest of our lives, it's almost irrational not to be somewhat dismayed by that, and maybe a little bit, why me? But the next stage after that he talks about is the quiet desperation stage, where you're seeking for answers. One of the things he talks about is what he calls find another doctor, because we think, okay, maybe I'm just not getting the right help or the right whatever. I also would say that today we might look at it as find another medication or find another treatment. So while we've kind of accepted the fact that we have MS, we're not necessarily content to stay the course on whatever we're doing to try and combat it. The next step, if we get through that, is the coping step. And I think that this one is one where a lot of us spend a lot of time. So we either ignore that we have MS as best we can, or we try to stay busy. We take our minds off of it as best we can. We try to find out what life is like when we are going to have multiple sclerosis as a daily companion. There's still got to be a life there. So we're just learning to cope with it. And I think the next step, prevailing, I don't know if that's even really accurate to say that you prevail over MS, but he's talking about accepting it, adjusting it, and going on from there. You have to keep making adjustments in your life as you need to, but that you can prevail over it, he said. And I do think in this case, attitude is everything, because your body is what it is. It's doing what it's doing. There's only a certain extent that you can ignore it and get away with it, right? So prevailing is largely attitude. And then finally, the last step he's got there is conquering. I know that's hard to read. I photocopied it out of the book and it wouldn't lie flat. But conquering is a step that it needs to be there. But quite frankly, how many of us could honestly say we've conquered our MS because it's there and it has a way of making its presence known? So I'm not really sure that I even have tasted what it's like to conquer MS. I feel like I spend a lot of time between prevailing and coping. It depends on the day and it depends on how my symptoms are doing. But I think that's probably reasonable. I do think I've gotten past the crashing and the quiet desperation. It's a rare day when I say, why me? And I really never feel like giving up. So I think in that sense, maybe I have kind of come to terms with what I have, what my life is likely to be from here on out. Let me know what you think. Have you come to that same conclusion for yourself? Are you at a different stage than that? Let me know. I'd love to hear. So there you have it, a very interesting memoir from someone who dealt with MS even before what they used to call the ABC drugs, Avonex, Betaseron, Copaxone, were even on the horizon. But I think that there's so much commonality, even regardless of that, that I hope you found this as interesting as I did. You can still buy this book on Amazon and probably elsewhere. In its brand new hardcover form, it's over $50, believe it or not. It's only a short book. It's only 150 pages or so, but not the least expensive. You can get a used copy for somewhere in the 20s. So if you're interested, you can go check it out. I might even encourage you to do that. He's very candid and very honest, and I do appreciate that. It's always good to hear other people's experience with multiple sclerosis, because we can see both at the same time the similarities with our own multiple sclerosis and also the differences. Every case of MS is distinct. That's one thing that this book makes very clear to me. No two are the same, and we shouldn't expect them to be. It's probably one of the reasons why it's such a frustrating disease to treat. But regardless, we're all in this together and we know it, and so anything we can share to help each other, I think it's a good idea. Let me know in the comments if you agree with this model for how you deal with chronic illness, the different stages, or if you disagree. I'd love to know that too. So I hope that I will be hearing from you. But in the meantime, take really good care of yourself. I'll see you again in my next video.